Judith had always believed in structure. Schedules, routines, carefully packed lunches. These were the things that made life manageable, the things she could control. Taking care of Max was the best job she'd ever had, even if it meant navigating the whirlwind of his billionaire father's world. Graham Ashford was, as far as bosses went, a decent one. Aloof, always busy, but decent. Their interactions were brief and businesslike, conducted through assistants or clipped text messages. As long as Max was happy, Judith had no complaints. Today was meant to be simple. Max had earned a treat after a week of particularly good behavior, so she took him to a small cafe a few blocks away from the Ashford estate. It wasn't the kind of place Graham would step into, too casual, too ordinary. Judith liked that about it. The smell of fresh pastries filled the air as they stepped inside, and Max's face lit up at the display case, his small fingers pressing against the glass as he debated between a chocolate croissant and a blueberry muffin. She ordered a coffee, knowing she wouldn't have time to finish it, and helped Max make his decision. The barista, a friendly woman with a nose ring and bright green nails, handed over their order with a smile. "You two make an adorable pair," she said, passing Judith the change. Before Judith could respond, Max turned to her, his little face glowing with excitement. "Mommy, can I have some of your coffee?" The words landed in the air like a dropped glass. The cafe wasn't crowded, but the people who were there had the natural curiosity of city dwellers, always half listening, always ready to latch onto an unexpected moment. Judith felt her stomach tighten as she looked down at Max, his innocent expression completely unaware of the bomb he had just set off. She forced a smile. "Max, sweetie, I'm not your..." But before she could finish, a voice from the corner of the cafe cut in. "Did you just say, Mommy?" A man with an expensive-looking camera slung over his shoulder leaned forward, eyes sharp with interest. He wasn't holding the camera up, not yet, but Judith could already see where this was going. Max, still oblivious, nodded. "Yeah. Judith takes care of me all the time." Judith's heart started pounding. She reached for Max's hand. "All right, buddy, time to head back." Too late. The click of a camera lens snapping into place was unmistakable. She turned just in time to see the flash go off, the photographer grinning like he had just won the lottery. "Wait, hold on," he said, already scrolling through his photos. "Are you saying you're married to Graham Ashford?" Judith didn't dignify that with an answer. She was already ushering Max toward the door, gripping his hand a little tighter than usual. "Let's go, sweetheart." The journalist didn't follow, but that didn't matter. She knew how these things worked. A man like Graham was always under the media's microscope, and anything that even remotely hinted at a scandal spread like wildfire. She could already imagine the headlines. By the time they returned to the estate, she was on edge. She got Max settled in his playroom with his favorite dinosaur figurines, then pulled out her phone. It had started. A handful of gossip sites had already picked up the story, their headlines ranging from mildly curious to outright dramatic. Graham Ashford's secret family? Billionaire's son calls nanny mommy in public. Others speculated about whether Graham had been hiding a secret wife, an old affair, or something even more scandalous. The worst part was the photo. Max's face was blurred, but Judith's wasn't. She was mid-motion, caught in the act of hurrying him out, which, of course, only made it look like she had something to hide. She barely had time to process it before her phone buzzed again. A message from Graham's assistant, Leslie. "Mr. Ashford needs to see you. Now." Graham's office was at the far end of the house, a space as sleek and intimidating as the man himself. Judith knocked once before stepping inside, bracing herself. Graham was behind his desk, phone in hand, his expression unreadable. He looked up, eyes locking onto hers with the kind of intensity that made most people shrink. "Sit," he said. Judith sat. Graham exhaled through his nose, pinching the bridge as if willing away a headache. Do you want to explain why half the internet thinks I've been hiding a wife? She had expected anger, maybe even outright yelling. But this was something else. Controlled, sharp, the kind of displeasure that came from a man who didn't like surprises. It was a misunderstanding, she said quickly. Max, he called me that without thinking. He was excited. A photographer overheard. I tried to get out of there, but it was too late. Graham turned his phone around, showing her the article. And you didn't think to call me the second this happened? I was dealing with Max, she shot back, then took a deep breath. I was going to tell you. But it's not like I could stop it. He set the phone down and leaned back, studying her like a problem he needed to solve. This will blow over, he said, more to himself than to her. A statement, maybe. Deny everything. Clarify your role. She nodded. That's fine with me. But before either of them could say another word, there was another knock. Leslie, efficient as always, stepped in without waiting for permission. She was already holding her tablet, her expression unusually tight. We have a problem, she said. Investors are asking questions. Graham's jaw tightened. What kind of questions? They want reassurance that there are no surprises in your personal life. Graham didn't move, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Judith felt the weight of what Leslie was saying. This wasn't just a stupid gossip piece anymore. This was something that could affect Graham's company, his bottom line. He turned back to Judith. This is going to be handled. Immediately. She lifted her chin, refusing to shrink under his gaze. Good. Because I didn't ask to be in the middle of this. For a moment, something flickered in his expression, something almost like regret. Then it was gone, replaced by calculation. I'll have my team draft a statement, he said. Until then, I need you to lay low. She didn't argue. She didn't have to. Because as much as she hated being told what to do, she knew he was right. And deep down, she had the sinking feeling that this wasn't over. Not even close. Graham was used to headlines. They followed him like shadows, most of them tedious, some mildly irritating, a few requiring actual damage control. But this? This was absurd. He scrolled through the endless stream of articles, each one more ridiculous than the last. Secret wife? Mysterious nanny? The truth about Graham Ashford's private life was trending on 3 different platforms. A popular morning show was running a segment titled Billionaire Father, Secret Family, with 2 self-proclaimed relationship experts analyzing the emotional cues from a grainy cafe photo. He set his phone down, rubbing his temples. This was spiraling faster than he'd anticipated. The official statement Leslie's team had put out, dry, professional, carefully worded, had done nothing to slow the wildfire. If anything, it had poured gasoline on it. Sir, Leslie said from the other side of his desk, we have another problem. He didn't even look up. Of course we do. Your in-laws have released a statement. Now he looked up. What? Leslie handed him her tablet. The press release was brief, polished, and sharp as a knife. Selena and Harlan Langford are deeply concerned about the well-being of their grandson. In light of recent events, they are reviewing all legal options to ensure Max is raised in a stable and supportive environment. Graham let out a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. They're using this. They've been waiting for something like this. They're calling it an emergency custody review, Leslie said. They're arguing that you, she paused, as if weighing whether to soften the words, then decided against it, are prioritizing your public image over Max's well-being. Graham gave a short, humorless laugh. So their solution is to rip him out of his home and parade him around as a legal pawn? Leslie didn't respond. She didn't have to. They both knew this wasn't about Max. Selena and Harlan had never approved of Graham. They had tolerated him when Cindy was alive, but after her passing, tolerance had turned into thinly veiled contempt. In their eyes, he was too cold, too detached, too wrapped up in his business to be a real father. "I need my lawyers on this now," he said. "Not tomorrow, not in an hour, now." "I already called them." Leslie hesitated. "There's something else." He closed his eyes briefly. "Of course there is." Max saw something. The words hit harder than expected. Graham straightened. "What do you mean?" Leslie exhaled. Judith found him looking at a tabloid on one of the housekeeper's tablets. He saw a headline about his real family. Graham's grip on the tablet tightened. "And?" He asked if he was going to have to leave. The tightness in his chest was unfamiliar. Unwelcome. He forced himself to focus. "Did Judith explain?" "She did her best," Leslie said. "But I think he needs to hear it from you." He nodded, already standing. "Where is he now?" "Playroom." Graham made his way down the hall, passing the grand staircase, the towering windows overlooking the city. The house was too big, too quiet. It had never felt like a home, not really. But it was Max's. When he stepped into the playroom, he found Max sitting on the floor, lining up his toy dinosaurs in an order only he understood. Judith was on the couch nearby, watching him carefully, her expression guarded. She looked up as Graham entered. "He's been quiet." Graham crouched beside his son. "Hey, buddy." Max didn't look up. "Hi." Graham picked up one of the dinosaurs, turning it in his hands. "I heard you saw something today." Max nodded. "It said I might have a different family." Graham swallowed the immediate urge to destroy every tabloid in existence. "That's not true. Your family is right here." Max finally looked at him. "But they said I might have to go somewhere else." Judith shifted slightly, as if ready to intervene, but she stayed quiet. Graham kept his voice steady. "No one is taking you anywhere." Max studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay." He went back to his dinosaurs, as if that was the end of it. Graham met Judith's gaze. She didn't say anything, but he could see it in her expression. This wasn't over. Back in his office, his legal team was waiting. 3 of them, sitting stiffly in the leather chairs opposite his desk, laptops open, notepads filled with legal jargon. "The custody petition hasn't been officially filed yet," one of them said. "They're testing the waters, seeing if you'll react." Graham leaned back. "Then let's make something clear. If they think they can take my son, they're going to war." The lawyer nodded. "We'll be ready." As the meeting wrapped up, Leslie reappeared. "There's more." "Of course there is," he muttered. "What now?" "The Tyndall merger," she said. "It's stalled." He stiffened. "They're pulling out?" "They're considering it." Graham exhaled slowly. The Tyndall merger had been in progress for months. A deal that would secure the next decade of Ashford Holdings. The kind of deal that could make or break a legacy. "They're worried about instability," Leslie continued. Their exact words were "uncertain family dynamics and media distractions." Graham resisted the urge to throw something. "They think a gossip piece is a business liability." "They think custody battles make for bad press," Leslie said. "And bad press makes for bad investments." He stood, walking to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city stretched below him, a skyline built on power, reputation, control. Things he had spent his entire life mastering. But this wasn't just about him anymore. "Set up a call with Tyndall," he said. "I'll handle it myself." "I already did," Leslie said. Tomorrow morning. He nodded. Good. She hesitated. Sir, we need to consider the optics here. If this custody fight drags out. It won't, he interrupted. She gave him a look. If it drags out, she continued, unfazed, you need to think about how to present yourself. The narrative is out of control. He turned. What are you suggesting? Her expression was unreadable. You need to look like a stable father. The implication hung in the air. He already knew what she was getting at. He just didn't want to say it. Judith. The public already believed she was something more than a nanny. She was the only person in Max's life who wasn't a legal team, a board member, or a business associate. He exhaled sharply. Absolutely not. Leslie didn't argue. She didn't need to. The idea was already in his head. As she left, Graham sat back down at his desk. The articles were still open on his screen, the headlines relentless. He closed them one by one. Then he picked up his phone and called Judith. Judith had expected many things when Graham called her into his office. A lecture, maybe. A demand that she stay out of sight until the scandal died down. A firm request to remind Max that words mattered, especially when spoken in public places where men with cameras lurked like hungry seagulls. But not this. Definitely not this. Graham sat behind his desk, composed, unruffled, the picture of a man who had made bigger, more shocking deals in his lifetime. He might as well have been discussing a merger or a stock acquisition. Judith, on the other hand, felt like she had been thrown off a cliff. You want me to what? She asked, certain she had misheard. Marry me, Graham said, like he was confirming a lunch reservation. Temporarily. She let out a short, stunned laugh. Right. Temporarily. 6 months. 6 months? He leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the desk, his expression steady. The custody petition is already in motion. The investors are spooked. Right now, the public thinks you're my secret wife, my long-lost love, my hidden affair, whatever nonsense they've latched onto. If we deny it outright, it looks defensive. But if we lean into it, if we control the narrative. She stared at him. You're seriously suggesting we get married to stabilize your reputation? It's mutually beneficial. She nearly choked. For who? You. That did it. She stood up, shaking her head. I work for you. I take care of Max. I make sure he eats vegetables and goes to bed on time. I am not some corporate pawn you can slot into your strategy like a well-placed press release. Graham didn't move, didn't react. Sit down, Judith. I don't think I will. His voice remained level. You haven't heard everything yet. She should have walked out. She should have told him exactly where he could put his legal proposal and gone straight to Leslie to give her resignation. But she didn't. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the absurdity of it all. Or maybe it was the small, nagging thought that this wasn't something Graham would do lightly. She sat back down. I understand how this sounds, he said, folding his hands in front of him. But look at the situation. You've been dragged into this, and it won't go away anytime soon. This isn't just about me, your name is in every article next to mine. People are picking apart your life, your job, your history. The media is relentless, and unfortunately, so is public perception. She hated that he wasn't wrong. The articles had been invasive, painting her as everything from a devoted, hidden partner to a scheming gold digger. Reporters had already harassed her neighbors, her former employers. The housekeeper had even mentioned a car parked outside the estate with a long-lens camera sticking out the window like a periscope. Still, she shook her head. So your solution is marriage? The right marriage, he corrected. A structured agreement. A business arrangement. She exhaled through her nose. You are unbelievable. It would be clean. 6 months. No expectation beyond that. We present a stable family image, the custody case weakens, the investors regain confidence, and when the time comes, we part ways with a carefully curated narrative. And then what? She asked. You issue another press release? Graham Ashford and his beloved wife of 6 months amicably divorce, citing irreconcilable PR strategies? He didn't even blink. Essentially. Judith rubbed her temples. I'm not doing this. You might want to reconsider. She stiffened. Excuse me? I'm not threatening you, he said calmly. But the media storm isn't going to end overnight. And your professional reputation is already taking a hit. That's ridiculous. I'm a nanny. This will blow over, and I'll find another job. Graham slid a folder across the desk. Take a look. She hesitated, then opened it. Inside were printouts of messages, emails, and responses from potential employers. Given the current controversy, we are unable to consider Ms. Marceau for this position at this time. Due to recent publicity, we are moving forward with another candidate. At this moment, we require a candidate with a lower media profile. Her stomach dropped. You had someone dig into my job applications? I needed to know how bad the damage was, he said. Turns out, it's worse than expected. She closed the folder, pressing her fingers against it. This isn't fair. I know. She looked at him then, really looked at him. He didn't seem pleased about any of this. He wasn't gloating, wasn't manipulating. He was presenting a solution, as unthinkable as it was. Still, the thought of marrying him, even temporarily, was beyond outrageous. There has to be another way, she said. If there were, we wouldn't be sitting here. Judith leaned back, arms crossed, staring at the ceiling. 6 months. Yes. And then I walk away? Yes. With my name cleared? Yes. She exhaled. I need time to think. You don't have much. She shot him a look. I'm aware. He nodded once. I'll have Leslie send over the details. Review them. Ask whatever questions you need. She stood up again, slower this time. If I say no? Graham didn't flinch. Then you walk away, and I figure out another solution. The simplicity of his answer threw her. There was no manipulation, no guilt-tripping. Just a matter-of-fact statement. I'll let you know, she said, and left. Judith spent the next 48 hours in a state of silent war with herself. Every instinct screamed at her to reject the offer. It was absurd. It was unnatural. It was something straight out of a made-for-TV drama, the kind her mother used to watch on lazy Sunday afternoons. But the reality was unavoidable. She had applied to 10 positions. 10 rejections. She had reached out to 2 former employers. Both politely declined to get involved. And the reporters weren't going anywhere. By the 3rd day, she knew. She called Graham. I have conditions. He didn't sound surprised. I'm listening. I keep my job. Done. I maintain my autonomy. No controlling where I go, who I see, what I do outside of appearances. Fair. I want legal protection. A contract that ensures I walk away untouched. No complications. Already in the works. She closed her eyes. And compensation. He didn't hesitate. Name it. She said the number. There was a pause. Then, done. She opened her eyes. I'll sign. I'll have Leslie send everything over. Judith ended the call and set her phone down. This was happening. Judith signed her name with steady hands, but inside, she felt like she was pressing a detonator. It wasn't the sheer absurdity of what she was doing, though that certainly played a role. It was the terrifying permanence of ink on paper. Once it was done, it was done. There was no waking up tomorrow and pretending it had all been a bizarre dream, no peeling her name off the document like a sticker. She was agreeing, in a legally binding way, to become Graham Ashford's wife. For 6 months. Leslie, ever efficient, gathered the signed pages into a sleek folder. That's it, she said, checking her watch. I'll have copies sent over to your email. Graham nodded, standing as if he'd just concluded a business meeting, which, for him, this probably was. We'll need to be seen together immediately. The media cycle moves fast, and the sooner we establish our story, the better. Judith gave him a look. Our story. He didn't blink. Yes. We've been in a private relationship for over a year. We kept it quiet for Max's sake, but given the circumstances, we're now making it official. She let out a slow breath. Of course we are. The wedding is in a week. Judith closed her eyes for a brief moment. Naturally. It didn't matter that the ceremony was just for show. There wouldn't be a packed church or a blushing bride, just a sterile exchange of vows in front of a select group of people who had been carefully vetted to sell the illusion. A handful of high-profile guests, just enough to make it look real. A controlled leak to the media, because if there wasn't a leak, it would look suspicious. And, most importantly, an official set of photographs that would be carefully distributed to ensure the correct narrative took hold. They left Leslie's office and stepped into a waiting car, already heading toward the city. Judith barely had time to process one surreal moment before plunging into another. By the time they arrived at the venue, an upscale restaurant, chosen specifically for its exclusivity, there were already cameras waiting. It was impossible to tell whether they had been tipped off or if this was just what happened when a man like Graham Ashford left his house. Judith barely had time to register anything before Graham placed a hand on the small of her back and guided her inside. It was the first time he had touched her. The gesture was purely for show, but it still caught her off guard. The maitre d' greeted them with a knowing smile, leading them to a private table tucked away from the main floor but still visible enough for the strategically placed photographers outside. The moment they sat down, a waiter poured them wine they hadn't ordered, and Judith realized this was all choreographed. Of course it was. This wasn't a date. It was a press release with appetizers. She picked up her glass, keeping her voice low. Do I at least get to know my favorite color? Graham didn't look up from the menu. Excuse me? If we've been in a secret relationship for a year, I assume you'd know basic things about me. Favorite color, favorite movie, middle name. Otherwise, it's going to look strange when we eventually do an interview and I stare blankly when asked what my own husband got me for my birthday. He finally met her gaze, assessing. Green. She blinked. What? Your favorite color, he said. It's green. She stared at him. How do you? You always pick the green mug in the kitchen, he said simply. And you buy Max clothes in green more than any other color. Judith didn't respond. She had been prepared to fake a relationship, not to find out he had been paying attention to anything about her at all. The official announcement went out that night. Carefully worded, it hit all the key points. Graham Ashford and longtime partner Judith Marceau are delighted to announce their marriage. Having kept their relationship private for Max's well-being, they now look forward to stepping into this new chapter as a family. Judith stared at the words, feeling an odd detachment from them, as if they belonged to someone else entirely. The story spread quickly, picked up by every major media outlet. Within hours, there were articles analyzing their romantic timeline, posts dissecting body language from every public appearance they had shared, and even an op-ed speculating about the impact of a billionaire marrying a nanny. By the next morning, Judith's social media, which she rarely used, had exploded. There were messages from strangers, some congratulatory, some suspicious, some downright bizarre. People who were suddenly invested in a love story that didn't exist. Max, at least, was thrilled. She found him in the playroom, clutching his dinosaur figurines, his face lit up with excitement. "Are we really a family now?" Judith knelt down beside him, brushing a curl from his forehead. "We've always been a family, sweetheart." He grinned. "But now it's official?" She hesitated for half a second, then nodded. "Yes, it's official." Graham watched the exchange from the doorway, saying nothing. When Judith finally met his gaze, his expression was unreadable. He had gotten what he wanted, a stable family image, a controlled narrative, a way to protect his custody case. She had gotten what she had bargained for, financial security, legal protection, a clean slate once it was over. And yet, as Max beamed up at her, something about it felt profoundly irreversible. Judith had always considered herself adaptable. She had handled fussy toddlers, difficult parents, chaotic school pickups, and dinner-time negotiations that rivaled international peace treaties. But nothing had prepared her for this. The dress was too tight. The shoes pinched. The jewelry on loan from some designer she had never heard of was so heavy it felt like a financial liability hanging from her ears. Yet none of that compared to the suffocating awareness that every eye in the room was watching her, some with thinly veiled curiosity, others with open scrutiny. The gala was Graham's first official appearance since their wedding, a charity event filled with impossibly well-dressed people who floated from conversation to conversation as if they had been born knowing which fork to use and which scandals to whisper about between sips of champagne. Judith, on the other hand, was acutely aware that she did not belong. "You're overthinking it," Graham murmured beside her, not looking at her but sensing her discomfort all the same. Judith gave him a sharp smile. "That's easy to say when you've done this your entire life." His mouth twitched, almost amused. "Smile. There's a photographer to your left." She did, though it felt unnatural. The camera clicked. Somewhere in a newsroom, an article was already being drafted about how effortlessly they fit together. As the evening went on, people approached, their smiles polite but their words carefully measured. "How lovely to finally meet you," said a woman in an emerald dress that looked like it had been stitched together by the gods. "Graham has kept you such a secret." Judith returned the smile. "We valued our privacy." "And you were his son's nanny, correct?" There it was. The first thinly veiled jab. Judith held her expression steady. "Yes. And now I'm his wife." The woman blinked, as if she hadn't expected her to be so direct. Then she let out a light laugh, the kind reserved for people who considered themselves above discomfort. "Well, how wonderful." Judith excused herself before she said something regrettable. The interviews came next. A carefully staged conversation with a reputable magazine. The journalist asked the expected questions. How did they meet? What made their relationship work? What was it like adjusting to this new phase? Judith stuck to the script. They had met naturally, bonding over their shared care for Max. Graham's dedication to fatherhood had been one of the many things she had admired about him. Their decision to marry had been private, personal, and deeply meaningful. She almost managed to believe herself. Outside the controlled spaces, reality was less polished. Max had always been affectionate, but now he clung to her in a way that was both endearing and heartbreaking. "Can we bake cookies tomorrow?" he asked one morning, as she helped him into his shoes. Judith smiled. "Of course, sweetheart. And Daddy too?" She hesitated. Graham had barely been home in the past week, caught up in meetings and business obligations that somehow always took priority. "We'll ask him." Max nodded, satisfied, and Judith wondered how long it would take before he noticed that things weren't quite what they seemed. Graham, for his part, kept their interactions strictly transactional. They appeared together when necessary, spoke when required, and otherwise lived separate lives within the same house. He was polite but distant, engaged but detached. It was, in a way, exactly what they had agreed to. And yet, when Judith lay in bed at night, staring at the ceiling of a room that was too grand, too impersonal, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had become part of a story she didn't know how to control. Judith had thought the worst was behind her. The media frenzy had settled into a predictable rhythm, her public appearances had become slightly less nerve-wracking, and she was getting better at answering invasive questions with a carefully practiced smile. But then, the headlines changed. Graham Ashford's sham marriage? Late wife's parents challenge custody. It was impossible to ignore. Every article dissected the timeline of their relationship, questioning the legitimacy of the marriage and quoting sources who claimed the wedding had been rushed for suspicious reasons. But the real bombshell came from Harlan and Selena Langford themselves, who had issued a statement questioning Graham's ability to provide Max with a stable, loving environment. Judith read the statement twice, bile rising in her throat. They weren't just implying that Graham was a bad father. They were laying the groundwork to take Max away. She found Graham in his office, standing by the window, phone pressed to his ear. His posture was stiff, his free hand clenched at his side. "Let me make one thing very clear," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "This will not go to court." Judith didn't need to hear the other side of the conversation to know that was exactly where it was headed. When he finally ended the call, he turned to her. "They filed this morning," he said flatly. Her stomach dropped. "What does that mean?" "It means," he said, walking to his desk and picking up a folder, "that they're officially contesting my custody. They're arguing that our marriage is fraudulent and that I'm unfit to raise Max." Judith sank into the chair across from him. "They can't actually prove that." "They don't have to," he muttered, flipping through the paperwork. "They just have to create enough doubt." She exhaled slowly. "So what happens now?" Graham rubbed his temples. "Now? We fight." They spent the next several hours with Graham's legal team, who laid out the situation with the precision of surgeons preparing for a high-risk operation. The Langfords were pushing for an emergency hearing, arguing that Max needed to be removed immediately while a full custody review was conducted. Their case relied heavily on the argument that Graham was too focused on his business to be a present father, and that Judith was a hired stand-in rather than a legitimate parental figure. "They're playing dirty," one of the lawyers said. "They want the court to think Max is nothing more than an accessory in your carefully curated public image." Judith's nails dug into her palms. "And what do we do?" Graham's expression was unreadable. "We make sure they don't win." The house felt different after that. Lawyers came and went, meetings stretched late into the night, and phone calls became urgent whispers behind closed doors. Even Leslie, usually the picture of composure, looked tense. Judith tried to keep things normal for Max, but children weren't stupid. He noticed the tension. The way Graham barely sat down for dinner anymore, the way Judith's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. And then, one evening, he overheard. Judith had stepped into the hall to grab her phone when she heard voices from Graham's office. She wouldn't have paid attention, but the door was slightly open, and a single word made her freeze. "Take." She moved closer, her stomach twisting. "They can try," Graham was saying, his voice sharp. "But they won't take him from me." There was a pause. Then Leslie's voice, softer but no less serious. "We need to be prepared for every outcome." Judith barely registered the rest of the conversation because, down the hall, Max stood in the doorway of his bedroom, his face pale. Her heart sank. "Max." His lower lip trembled. "Are they taking me away?" Judith crossed the hall in seconds, kneeling in front of him. No, sweetheart. No one is taking you anywhere. But I heard them. His little hands curled into fists. They said someone might take me. She took his hands gently. That's not going to happen. Your dad is fighting for you. We both are. His chin wobbled. But what if they win? She swallowed the lump in her throat. They won't. Max's arms wrapped around her neck, holding on like she was the only thing keeping him grounded. Judith hugged him tightly, wishing she could make a promise she was certain she could keep. Judith found Graham in his office, staring at the glow of his computer screen like it held the key to solving everything. His sleeves were rolled up, his tie loosened just enough to suggest he had been at this for hours. There were 3 empty coffee cups on his desk, a tablet blinking with unread notifications, and a legal document open in front of him that he clearly wasn't reading. She didn't knock. She just walked in and folded her arms. Max is terrified. Graham didn't look up. I know. She narrowed her eyes. Then why are you here instead of with him? That got his attention. He leaned back in his chair, finally meeting her gaze. Because I'm handling it. Judith let out a sharp laugh. Handling it? You mean sitting in meetings, reading legal briefs, and talking to a bunch of people who don't even know Max? He doesn't need lawyers right now, Graham. He needs his dad. His expression remained unreadable. I don't have the luxury of sitting with him and telling him everything is going to be fine. You mean you don't want to? She shot back. Something in his jaw tightened. I don't see how that's relevant. It's relevant because your son is scared, she snapped. Because he's a little boy who needs reassurance, and instead of giving it to him, you're buried in your emails like they're going to hug him goodnight. Graham exhaled slowly, his fingers pressing together in front of him. Max has everything he needs. She stared at him, almost laughing at the absurdity of the statement. No, he doesn't. He has a stable home, Graham continued, as if she hadn't spoken. A world-class education. The best doctors, the best tutors, the best security team. He is safe, he is cared for, and he will not be taken from me. Safe and cared for aren't the same thing as loved. His expression barely flickered, but something shifted in his posture. I love my son. I know, Judith said, her voice quieter now. But does he? Graham stiffened. She pushed forward. Max doesn't care about the legal case. He doesn't care about your investors or your reputation. He cares that he barely sees you. That you come home late, that you miss dinner, that he has to ask me if you'll have time to play with him. I work so that he has everything. No, you work because you don't know how to stop, she countered. You think money is enough, that providing is the same as parenting, but it's not. He's a child, Graham. He doesn't need another trust fund. He needs you. He stood then, slow and deliberate, as if measuring his movements. This is not a conversation I need to have with you. Well, someone needs to have it with you, she shot back. They stood in silence, the air between them charged with something Judith couldn't quite define. Graham had been challenged before, by board members, competitors, journalists, but she doubted any of them had ever questioned him about bedtime stories and missed soccer games. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then, with something like reluctant curiosity, he asked, "What would you have me do?" Judith exhaled, her frustration simmering into something softer. Be his dad. Graham didn't answer, but this time, he didn't dismiss her either. The ballroom was a sea of polished perfection. Women in glittering gowns, men in impossibly tailored suits, champagne flowing as if the mere idea of an empty glass was offensive. It was the kind of event where people smiled too much, where laughter was just a bit too loud, and where everyone pretended to care deeply about the cause they were supporting, while in reality, they were there to be seen. Judith adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist, another borrowed accessory from a brand desperate for exposure, and smiled at the woman across from her, nodding at something she hadn't actually heard. She was getting good at this. Good at smiling at the right moments, at offering vague but elegant responses when someone asked how she and Graham had managed to keep their love story a secret. Good at pretending any of this was normal. Across the room, Graham was deep in conversation with a group of investors, his posture relaxed, his smile just the right amount of charming. She knew that version of him well, the one who could convince anyone of anything, the one who never looked uncertain or unprepared. A waiter passed by, and Judith reached for a glass of champagne, but before she could take a sip, a voice cut through the air, sharp and direct. "Judith, isn't it?" She turned and found herself face to face with a reporter whose name she couldn't remember, but whose face had been plastered across enough gossip segments to make her stomach tighten. She forced a polite smile. "I'm sorry, I was just..." "It's been so fascinating watching your story unfold," the woman interrupted, smiling as if they were old friends. "No one saw this coming. A billionaire falling for his son's nanny, it's like something out of a movie." Judith resisted the urge to correct her. That was the entire point, after all, to make sure everyone believed exactly that. "How did you keep it a secret for so long?" the reporter pressed. "A relationship like this, under constant scrutiny? That must have been difficult." Judith's grip tightened around the glass. "We valued our privacy." "Of course," the reporter said smoothly. "But surely there were challenges. I mean, it must have been quite the shift, one day an employee, the next his wife. What was the hardest part of that transition?" "It was a trap. She knew it the way a deer knows a hunter is nearby. If she said it had been easy, they would call her a liar. If she admitted it had been difficult, they would pick apart every word, searching for inconsistencies. "I suppose it was just adjusting to the attention," she said finally. "Graham and I never sought the spotlight, but we understand it comes with the territory." The woman tilted her head. "And when did you know that he was the one?" Judith's throat went dry. She had rehearsed answers for everything: how they met, why they had kept things private, what they loved about each other. But she had never rehearsed the moment when someone would ask her about something real. "I think," she said, carefully, "I always knew Graham was someone I admired. Someone who cared deeply about his family. That's what drew me to him. It wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the truth either." The reporter smiled, but there was something in her eyes that made Judith's stomach twist. Across the room, Graham was shaking hands with someone who did not look as charmed as the others. The man leaned in, speaking too low for anyone else to hear, but Judith could see the tension in Graham's shoulders. The investor's voice was clipped, his expression unreadable. "You expect us to believe this marriage is real?" Graham barely blinked. "I don't particularly care what you believe." The man gave a short, humorless laugh. "Come on, Ashford. A whirlwind romance, a sudden marriage, all right before a custody battle? It's convenient." Graham exhaled slowly. "It's private." "That's a nice sentiment," the investor said. "But privacy isn't an option when people are trusting you with their money. If there's instability in your personal life, it raises questions about your business decisions." Graham's jaw tightened. "My marriage has no effect on my company." The man smiled in a way that suggested he disagreed. "See that it doesn't." By the time Judith found Graham, the party was winding down. The music was softer, the crowd thinning, the air heavy with the scent of expensive perfume and too much champagne. She could tell immediately that something was off. "What happened?" she asked, keeping her voice low. Graham took a sip of his drink, his expression unreadable. "Nothing that concerns you." She let out a short laugh. "Right. Because none of this concerns me." He turned to her then, his gaze sharp. You don't need to worry about it. She took a step closer. You're not the only one playing a part, Graham. If someone is questioning us, I need to know. His expression flickered for a moment, just a moment, but then he looked away. It's handled. It wasn't. She knew it, and he knew she knew it. She didn't press further. She didn't need to. Because suddenly, the weight of all of it hit her at once. The constant scrutiny, the rehearsed answers, the fact that her life no longer belonged to her. Every word she spoke had to be measured, every step calculated. She had no privacy, no autonomy, no real say in anything. She didn't know who she was anymore. That night, back at the house, she sat at her desk, staring at a blank document on her laptop. Then she typed the words, "Resignation letter." She didn't overthink it. She didn't hesitate. She just wrote. By the time she finished, her hands were shaking. Max wasn't supposed to see the letter. Judith had left it on her desk, folded but not hidden, because she had planned to send it in the morning. She had spent all night debating whether she was making the right decision, but the longer she sat in that house, the more certain she became. This wasn't her life. It wasn't a marriage. It was a transaction, and she had let herself believe, even for a second, that she was something more than a carefully placed pawn. She should have locked her door. She should have tucked the letter away. But she hadn't, and now Max stood in front of her, clutching the paper in his small hands, his face pale with panic. "You're leaving?" His voice was so small it barely registered. Judith's stomach dropped. "Max." He shook his head, eyes already brimming with tears. "But you're my mom now." The words hit her like a punch to the chest. "Oh, sweetheart, no," she said quickly, kneeling in front of him. "I'm not leaving you. I would never leave you. But you wrote it." He shoved the letter toward her, his little hands trembling. "You wrote that you're leaving. Why?" Her throat felt tight. "It's complicated." "Then make it not complicated." His voice cracked, and suddenly, he was throwing himself at her, arms wrapped tightly around her neck, holding on like she might disappear if he let go. "Please don't go. I'll be good. I promise. I won't say dumb things to reporters anymore. I won't." Judith pulled him back just enough to cup his face. "Max, no. This isn't your fault." His chin wobbled. Then why? She could lie. She could tell him that everything was fine, that she had just been upset and wasn't actually going anywhere. But Max had already had enough people lie to him in his short life. So she told him the truth. Or at least, the part of it he could understand. "This isn't really a marriage," she said softly. "It's something your dad and I agreed to so we could keep you safe." Max blinked. "But you love us." She swallowed. "I love you." He clung to her again. "Then stay." Judith closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. "I need to talk to your dad." Max nodded against her shoulder. "Make him fix it." Graham was in his office, because of course he was. It was nearly midnight, but work never stopped for him, not when there were deals to finalize, calls to return, reputations to protect. She didn't bother knocking. He looked up when she walked in, taking in her expression. "What happened?" She tossed the letter onto his desk. "Max found this." His brow furrowed as he glanced at it. "You wrote a resignation letter." "Yes." He sat back, studying her. And he begged me not to go." Graham's jaw tightened slightly. "That's understandable." "Is it?" she snapped. "Because that little boy is terrified that I'm going to disappear from his life, and frankly, I don't know how to tell him that might be true." Graham was silent for a long moment. "You want out." She folded her arms. I want the truth. His expression didn't change. About what? Judith let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Don't do that. Don't act like you don't know exactly what I'm asking. Graham exhaled through his nose. Judith. Why did you really marry me? His fingers drummed lightly against the desk. You know why. No, she said, shaking her head. I know the version you fed me. The one where this all made sense because of the scandal, the optics, the custody case. But that doesn't explain why everything was so easy. The contract was drawn up in days, your PR team already had statements ready, the entire thing was too, she stopped, inhaling sharply. Too convenient. Graham didn't answer. Her pulse pounded in her ears. How long before Max called me Mommy in that cafe did you decide you needed to get married? His silence was answer enough. Judith's hands curled into fists. You were already planning it. Graham leaned forward, forearms resting on the desk. My legal team had started discussing options. You were the obvious choice. The obvious choice. Her stomach turned. So this had nothing to do with Max's slip-up. I didn't expect it to happen so fast, Graham admitted. But yes. The plan was already in motion. Judith let out a shaky breath, pressing her hands to her temples. Was I ever anything more than a strategy to you? His lips parted slightly, like he wanted to say something, but no words came out. She laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. Wow. You really had me convinced. I mean, I knew what this was, but I thought, she cut herself off, shaking her head. It doesn't matter what I thought. Judith. No, she snapped. You don't get to Judith me right now. She turned toward the door, but his voice stopped her. You are more than a strategy. She spun back around. Oh, really? Because you just admitted that I was a backup plan. A legal loophole wrapped up in a PR-friendly package. His jaw tightened. It wasn't like that. Then tell me how it was, she challenged. He didn't. Judith nodded once, as if something had finally clicked into place. Right, she said. That's what I thought. She walked out without another word. Judith had never been a woman who needed dramatics. She preferred reason, calm, and clear plans. But at that moment, standing in the center of Graham's office, the resignation letter still in her hand, she didn't care about being reasonable. I'm done, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I'm leaving. Graham didn't react at first. He just stared at her, as if waiting for her to take it back, to realize she was being impulsive. When she didn't, he leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose. You can't. Her laugh was sharp. I assure you, I can. We have a contract. Judith tossed the letter onto his desk, barely missing his laptop. And you have a team of lawyers who can figure out how to void it. He didn't look at the letter. Walking away now will only make things worse. For you. For me. For Max. Judith's jaw tightened. Don't you dare use Max to manipulate me. This isn't manipulation, Graham said coolly. It's reality. You leaving like this, unexpectedly, publicly, will start another media firestorm. One that I can't control. She folded her arms. That's not my problem. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate. It is if Max gets caught in the middle. Judith flinched, but she didn't back down. You think me staying is better? Continuing this lie, pretending everything is fine? It's temporary, he said. 6 months. That was always the agreement. She let out a breath, shaking her head. You really don't get it, do you? I thought this arrangement was about protecting Max, but it was never about him. It was about control. Control over the custody case. Control over the media. Control over me. His expression darkened. That's not true. No. She crossed her arms. Then tell me one decision I've actually made for myself since this started. Graham didn't answer. Judith swallowed the lump in her throat. I can't do this anymore. Not for 6 months. Not for 6 minutes. His jaw clenched. If you leave, you know what will happen. The press will twist the story. The Langfords will use it as ammunition. You're giving them exactly what they want. Judith stiffened. And what about what I want? Silence. She nodded once, the finality of it settling in her bones. That's what I thought. She turned and walked out before he could say anything else. The next morning, she packed quickly. Clothes, a few essentials, not much else. It wasn't like she had built a real life in that house. Her existence there had always felt temporary, like she was borrowing space in a world that wasn't hers. She was zipping up her suitcase when she heard a small, shaky voice behind her. You're really leaving? She turned to find Max standing in the doorway, his favorite dinosaur clutched in his arms. His eyes were already wet, his lower lip trembling. Judith's heart cracked straight down the middle. She knelt in front of him, smoothing his curls. Oh, sweetheart. He sniffled. But we're a family. Tears burned the back of her throat. We'll always be a family, baby. No matter what. His arms wrapped around her neck, tight and desperate. Then don't go. She held him, pressing a kiss to the top of his head. I have to. Max let out a little sob, pulling back just enough to look at her. What about Daddy? Judith swallowed hard. He's going to take care of you. But he doesn't know how, Max whispered. Her chest ached, because he wasn't wrong. Footsteps sounded in the hall, and a moment later, Graham appeared. He took in the scene, his face unreadable. Max, go downstairs. Max shook his head, holding on to Judith tighter. Graham's voice softened. Buddy. Max's little shoulders sagged, but he let go. He gave Judith one last, pleading look before dragging his feet toward the stairs. She wiped at her face, inhaling sharply before standing to face Graham. He was blocking the doorway. You don't have to do this. Judith exhaled slowly. Yes, I do. Something flickered in his eyes, frustration, maybe regret. You're making a mistake. Her lips pressed together. No, Graham. Marrying you was the mistake. She pushed past him before he could say anything else. The driver didn't ask questions when she climbed into the car. The gates of the Ashford estate shut behind her, closing off a chapter of her life she hadn't meant to write in the first place. It took 3 days for the press to catch wind of her departure. Headlines speculated about trouble in paradise, about the cracks in the perfect family image. Pundits debated whether the marriage had ever been real. It didn't matter. What mattered was that Judith was on her own, for the first time in months, and she had no idea what came next. She applied for jobs. She sent out resumes. The responses were slow, hesitant. The scandal followed her like a shadow, making it clear that she wasn't just Judith Marceau anymore. She was the nanny who married a billionaire. She kept going anyway. Back at the Ashford house, Graham was adjusting to life without her. Or at least, he was trying to. Max had always gravitated toward Judith. He had trusted her, confided in her, turned to her for comfort. Now, he barely spoke to Graham at all. Dinners were quiet. Mornings were tense. There were no bedtime stories, no playful arguments about dinosaur names, no whispered reassurances that everything would be okay. Max wasn't just missing Judith. He was mourning her. Graham had known this would be difficult. He just hadn't realized how much. The custody case pressed forward, and without Judith in the picture, his position was weaker. The Langfords had exactly what they needed, proof that his marriage had been a sham, that his home was unstable. His lawyers warned him that things weren't looking good. For the first time in his life, Graham wasn't sure he could fix this. Graham had spent his entire life controlling the narrative. He had built an empire on precision, numbers, strategies, calculated risks. Every decision was measured, every move deliberate. But this was different. This was the one thing he couldn't fix with spreadsheets and well-crafted press releases. The cameras flashed wildly as he stepped onto the podium, a dozen microphones lined up in front of him. The room was packed, reporters, analysts, investors, even a few of his own employees, all waiting for him to say something that could either salvage or completely destroy his reputation. He took a breath, steady but not deep. "My name is Graham Ashford," he began, his voice even. "And I have something to say." The room stilled, the anticipation thick. "I entered into a marriage arrangement with Judith Marceau," he said, watching as the murmurs rippled instantly through the crowd. "At the time, I believed it was the best course of action to protect my son and my legal position as his father. I won't insult your intelligence by pretending it was something it wasn't. It was calculated. It was strategic. And it was wrong." More whispers, more frantic note-taking. He let them process it before continuing. "But here's what I didn't expect. Judith became more than a name on a contract. She became the best mother figure my son has ever known. And when I realized that, I let her go." The room went silent. Graham exhaled. "I let her go because I had convinced myself that I could do this alone. That I could raise Max with structure and financial security and a well-planned schedule. But I was wrong. He doesn't just need a stable home. He needs love, and he needs the person who has been there for him in ways I never was." The flashes continued, some reporters looking genuinely stunned. Graham Ashford didn't make public miscalculations. He didn't admit mistakes. But here he was, telling the entire world that he had failed the most important person in his life. "I don't expect this statement to change how you see me," he said. "But I need you to know that, moving forward, the only thing I care about is my son's happiness." When he walked off the stage, Leslie was waiting, her expression unreadable. "Well," she said, tucking her tablet under her arm, "that was bold." The fallout was immediate. Some investors panicked, concerned about what the revelation meant for Ashford Holdings. The media ran with every possible angle. Some called it damage control, others called it genuine. But the public? The public saw something else entirely. They saw a man who wasn't perfect, who had made a mess of things, who had done what men like him never did, admitted he was wrong. Judith saw it too. She had been sitting in her small apartment, drinking coffee that had long gone cold, when she watched the press conference. She wasn't sure what she had expected, but it wasn't that. The phone rang an hour later. "Leslie. You're being called to testify," she said. "Custody hearing is moving forward." Judith had known this moment was coming, but now it was real. And terrifying. She arrived at the courthouse 2 days later, dressed simply, her heart pounding. She had faced reporters before, had learned how to navigate their invasive questions. But this wasn't about her. This was about Max. The cross-examination was brutal. The opposing attorney wasted no time. "You claim to be a stable parental figure in Max Ashford's life," the lawyer said, flipping through a file. "And yet, you left. How do you reconcile that?" Judith kept her voice steady. "I left because I realized the situation I was in wasn't healthy for anyone. But leaving Graham doesn't mean I left Max." The lawyer raised a skeptical brow. And yet, you haven't seen him in weeks. Judith clenched her hands together. Because I thought it was the right thing to do. I thought giving them space would make things easier. I see now that I was wrong. The lawyer smirked. You seem to admit to a lot of mistakes. She lifted her chin. Because parents make mistakes. But what matters is that Max knows, without a doubt, that he is loved. And he knows that, because I was there. Every bedtime story. Every scraped knee. Every moment he needed someone. The opposing attorney opened his mouth, but Judith didn't let him interrupt. I was there, she repeated, voice strong. And I want to keep being there. In the back of the courtroom, Max sat between a court-appointed guardian and Graham. He was too young to fully understand what was happening, but he could tell it was important. He kept looking between them, his small hands fidgeting. Graham watched him, something twisting in his chest. An hour later, he stood up in front of the judge. I am stepping down as CEO of Ashford Holdings. The words stunned the entire courtroom into silence. Even his own lawyers looked blindsided. I've spent my entire life building an empire, he continued, his voice measured. But it means nothing if my son doesn't know me. Harlan and Selena exchanged glances. They had prepared for a battle, had armed themselves with legal teams and public perception, but they hadn't prepared for this. They hadn't expected Graham to choose fatherhood over his legacy. Selena, who had been so certain Graham wasn't fit to be a parent, exhaled slowly. We need to talk. When the final agreement was signed, Graham and Judith walked out of the courthouse together. Max stays with me, Graham said, his voice softer now. But you'll have joint guardianship. He needs you. Judith searched his face, waiting for the catch. There wasn't one. He needs you too, she said. Graham looked over at Max, who was waiting by the car, his little face uncertain. I know, he said. And I'm ready. He wasn't sure if that was entirely true, but for the first time, he wanted to be. The thing about life, Judith had learned, was that it never unfolded the way you expected it to. If someone had told her a year ago that she would marry a billionaire, become tabloid fodder, and then quietly annul said marriage only to end up sharing custody of his son, she would have assumed they were describing the plot of a particularly unhinged romantic comedy. And yet, here she was. The paperwork had been finalized months ago. No fanfare, no headlines, just a quiet meeting in a law office where she and Graham had signed the documents that officially dissolved their marriage. The public had long since lost interest. The scandal had been replaced by new ones, fresher ones that involved actual affairs and secret offshore accounts. What mattered now was Max. Co-parenting was an experiment in patience. They had fumbled at first, missed pickups, scheduling conflicts, the occasional passive-aggressive email about bedtime routines, but eventually, they found a rhythm. Graham had surprised her by actually trying. He showed up when he said he would, learned how to pack a lunch that wasn't just protein bars and imported fruit, and even figured out which dinosaur names Max was currently obsessed with. Max flourished. Gone was the nervous little boy who had clung to her in doorways, terrified she might vanish. Now, he laughed easily, ran ahead at the park without looking over his shoulder every 2 seconds, and rattled off stories about my dad and me with a kind of confidence that had once seemed impossible. One evening, as Judith was tucking him into bed, Max curled into his pillow and grinned at her. I always knew you were my real family. She brushed a curl from his forehead, warmth spreading through her. Oh yeah? He nodded sleepily. Even before you married Daddy, I knew. Her heart ached in the best way possible. I love you, Max. He yawned. I know. Graham had been listening from the hallway. He didn't say anything when Judith stepped out, but something in his expression was softer, less guarded. She had made the right decision. Her new job was nothing glamorous. No luxury estates, no security details. Just a small but respected nonprofit that specialized in early childhood education, a position that felt right in a way nothing else ever had. She still saw Max almost every day, still got calls from Graham asking if a certain cough was normal or if she had a preferred method for dealing with bad dreams. Graham was adapting too. He had walked away from his empire, stunning the business world. Instead of mergers and acquisitions, his days were now filled with soccer practices, school drop-offs, and the occasional existential crisis over how to properly discipline a 6-year-old. He was still figuring it out, but he was there. That was what mattered. Somewhere along the way, he had started using his money for something other than power. A new initiative for single parents. A foundation in Cindy's name. Quiet donations to schools and community centers. His wealth hadn't disappeared, but it had changed shape, shifted into something that actually meant something. Max saw it. He no longer looked at his father and saw a stranger in a suit. He saw the man who made pancakes on weekends, who sat through animated movies without checking his phone, who had learned that bedtime stories weren't something you outsourced. Judith wasn't Graham's wife anymore. But she was still Max's person, the one who had been there from the beginning, the one who would always be there. And somehow, that was better. They weren't a traditional family. They weren't anything that fit into a neat little box. But they were something real. Something that finally made sense.